What we learnt from last weekend's Le Mans Grand Prix is that World Endurance can have issues with their regulations as well as Formula One, so we're all in the same boat, sort of. And it's all to do with that balance of performance thing, which is keeping Max Verstappen away from World Endurance. We're headed toward quite possibly the most well-known circuit to all the F1 teams aside from Bahrain. And that usually leads to a particularly dull race since everybody knows what the Circuit de Catalunya is capable of, and therefore there are no surprises. But quite frankly, after what we saw at the Monaco Grand Prix this year, where the overall lap times were close to Formula 2, and that you can count the amount of pit stops and overtakes conducted throughout the entire Grand Prix on two hands, plus me doing a... You can tell how disillusioned we all felt, and that anything would be better than Monaco in this current era. And the only thing that saved me from total despair was the fact that McLaren were doing well. The Formula 2 race beforehand was actually pretty good, and Ocon's heroics into Portier actually made things a little bit more interesting. But given the current situation with the championships, there could be some things which provide us with some intrigue here, much like with Imola earlier on in the year. This is going to be the next acid test as to dictate where the narrative of Formula One this year is going to go. The Emilia Romagna race basically showed us that there is something to be said about there being a potential challenger to Red Bull. Before then, we all thought it was going to be an absolute Max Verstappen cakewalk, and Red Bull would get the Constructors Championship again. The second time in, surprisingly, the amount of years they've been in the sport, which is incredibly bizarre. But no, we didn't get that. We got ourselves a little bit of a title bid. If this can be carried over to the Spanish Grand Prix, and we get an absolute surprising result, and considering what we can expect in terms of updates, which we'll discuss later, this could easily happen, we can then think, okay, there's no doubt about it, we have got something here. With so much data on this circuit, the teams will either commit to a full-on title bid for the team crown, or perhaps assess whether or not it might be worth focusing on next year instead, or maybe find more creative ways to lament about the 2026 regulations. Whenever I've heard the teams talk about these regulations and start to lament about them, I really don't hold much sympathy for it, because they were all talking about this in 2022, thinking the cars would be 3, 4, 5, 6 seconds slower than they were in 2021. And that was easily eclipsed within a year and a bit. Now they're just as quick as the previous cars, if not faster. The engineers can sort this out. It's just, change. And I would be more worried about this if Adrian Newey can condemn these rule changes, which so far he hasn't. And if you were thinking he was going to retire, then think again. He seems more intrigued about Formula One than ever. Sure, he's not exactly glowing about the regulations, but according to his comments to Motorsport Week, it points at the idea of just getting on with focusing on the challenge than rather complaining about it. But he does admit that some things about it are strange. One thing that Adrian points out about Formula One, which is actually quite good and relevant, is that it is a trailblazer in certain elements that do trickle down to regular cars, including the idea of regenerative braking, using electrical power, combined hybrid systems, and that the goal for 2026 will be to increase efficiency. And as we have seen with many automakers, sometimes you don't need to have really big techie whiz-bang stuff. You just need an efficient car, and then the rest will follow. However, Newey does admit that the rules weren't fully thought out in some places, and that there is a disconnect between the chassis department and the engine department, with the former needing to work out around the power unit, and that once again, Audi's courting from F1 had something to do with all of this. Although he does stop short of actually naming Audi, he just says 1 or 2 constructors have been focused around these regulations. But given where we are right now, Audi coming in, the VW group finally being tempted into the sport, and that Honda has now been encouraged to return to Formula One for the billionth time, it's quite obvious that Formula One and the FIA were tempting these two manufacturers to come back, to keep them sweet, give them rules that they can work with, and therefore tempt them at the expense potentially of all the other ones. They would just have to deal with it. And also, this is right in the middle of a resistance towards the electrification of car makers, because a lot of them are sort of backpedaling on their expectations for EVs. And also, Stefano Domenicali, the boss of Formula One, is also tempted about the idea for the next engine regulations about there being e-fuels and sustainable fuels, all alongside classic V8s and V10s, as encouraged by Sebastian Vettel's Race Without Trace campaign, meaning we can get the sound back, the classic engines, whilst also being kind to the planet. So, right now these regulations are looking a little weird, and I don't know whether Audi will actually come back to them, but, it's interesting. It's something to talk about. And oh yes, the other big news story to come in recent days is that the FIA has backtracked on its staunch anti-Verstappen legislation a few years back and will allow 17-year-olds to race in F1 again if they are judged to have recently and consistently demonstrated outstanding ability and maturity in single-seater Formula car competition They will be granted a super license at the age of 17 years old. So, okay, it's not exactly opening the floodgates to every single 17-year-old on the planet, but at least it does give some consideration, and that you don't need to go through a special dispensation process. You can just show that, hey, this kid's really, really good, you should probably hire them, and then the FIA go, oh yeah, they are, okay, sure. In all, it just makes the process far less rigid, and it makes it easier for young drivers who do show talent and skill, and it means that Toto doesn't have to call the FIA to go on about it, and he can stop calling them, or get his minion James to do it for him on the behalf of Mercedes for Williams. But it's quite obvious now that Kimi Antonelli will now have no reason to be denied a super license since he does have the points required to get one, and Mercedes needs something to focus on just in case George Russell turns out to not be the guy who will lead them into the new era of F1. Which, based on his performance at the Canadian Grand Prix, could be the case. Hopefully, it's just a case of him gaining more experience at the front end, but if this carries on and he continues to make mistakes time and time again, this might be a little bit tricky, and Kimi Antonelli arriving at Mercedes alongside him couldn't have come soon enough. I do feel bad for George, but that's just what happens in Formula 1. Brand new talent comes along who try to be the same as you, and it just makes me think, if only Sakir had gone by differently. Maybe if he had got that win, Bottas might have been out on his luck in 2021, and we might have seen Russell and Hamilton in that year. I'll give George a pass somewhat for this year, but if next year he can't perform and he is continuing to make mistakes whereas Antonelli holds his own, I could realistically see George out of Mercedes for 2026, and maybe out of F1 entirely. In any case, there is nothing holding Mercedes or Williams back from stinking Antonelli in an F1 car anymore, and the way they handle this will be the clearest indicator as to what the team relationship is with Lewis Hamilton right now, and how it's being handled with his exit velocity plan. How many practice sessions is Kimi Antonelli going to do this year for both teams, considering that Oliver Behrman is doing 6 for Haas, and he's already done 1 of them, and which sessions is Kimi going to be taking part in? Is it going to be a case that maybe for the British Grand Prix, Lewis is sat out in the favour of Antonelli? Can you imagine the chaos if that happened? Not that I'm willing for it to happen, but it'll be all the telling. You've got to be paying attention to what they do with Kimi right now, because there's no holds barred now. Is Lewis the one always to be benched in the favour of Kimi just to compare him to George, since that's what's going to be the lineup next year? Is Lewis just put to the curb? And if he is, not only is that extremely unprofessional, but it's just going to send the absolute world of F1 Twitter absolute into the stratosphere. Quite frankly, it's too horrific for me to contemplate anymore, so moving Taylor swiftly on. That one's for you, Fernando. The Spanish Grand Prix will be the testing ground for all top 4 teams, since these outfits are bringing new upgrades, supposedly, to this event, with even McLaren touting new parts after having originally intended for Silverstone to be their showcase in front of home fans. Although I didn't think they would have needed to, because right now, Norris and Piastri are the only 2 drivers to have competed in every single Grand Prix from start to finish, every single lap, no DNFs. They are the most reliable team out there, and quite frankly, they deserve a shot at the Constructors' title just for the sheer staying power of them all. So whilst McLaren have rushed parts for Spain, they are seemingly little tweaks to components within the car. They seemingly yet to push the "oh my god, we need to respond right now with major changes" button, which is seemingly the case for its rivals, Ferrari. I feel bad for any Ferrari fan right now, I really do. Monaco was such a tour de force, Charles Leclerc finally getting rid of that curse, the jinx having been lifted, and then he comes to the next race and completely flounders, doesn't even get into Q3. Fortunately though, it turns out it was an engine issue that compromised him, and overall, little bits and pieces of errors such as strategy and bad calls, it just all snowballed effectively. Hopefully, these were all human-related errors that can be easily corrected or rectified for the next race, and especially since they are bringing major upgrades to the Circuit de Catalunya, which have been rushed in from, again, Silverstone. The British Grand Prix was going to be a very big telling thing, but now because of Red Bull's vulnerability, everyone's rushing it forward. And after the Canadian Grand Prix, this upgrade couldn't come soon enough. Ferrari's Enrico Cardile approved the next phase of development, which Formula Uno dubbed the SF24 2.1. I guess with HP as their title sponsor now, these computer acronyms are making all the more sense. We should have seen this coming. It is a smart move though, since the parts will be installed and understood before the Austrian sprint weekend, because that has become quite obvious, even for McLaren in Miami, that bringing new parts to a sprint weekend doesn't always work out for you. And Red Bull might be bringing parts as well, but what exactly they're bringing to the table will not be made clear until we get to the show and tell part of the F1 weekend later in this week. But Christian Horner has hinted at a possible implementation of upgrades because, again, Red Bull does need to respond. And at the beginning of this year, they thought they could do what they did last year. Slowly bring upgrades every 5 or 6 races, they add a couple of tenths, that's all you need to do. You know, softly, softly. But in the era of diminishing returns, as said by their team boss, they do need to get a hurry on and sort of bring in upgrades that they might have wanted to bring in later in the year. They are being hustled, they are being hurried. And what happens when you rush parts? They could easily fail, or not work as intended. This is something that could affect all three teams, heck, even Mercedes, as it has done over the case of the last few upgrades. And they're bringing upgrades as well. Mercedes bringing a brand new floor to complement their front wing, which was brought in for Monaco, then brought to both cars in Canada, and has seemingly worked really well. That original front wing that caused controversy because of that little extra technicality was there as sort of a bandage for the case that it wasn't all quite working out for them, so this needed to be making up for the shortfalls, but now they've all been sorted out. That could be replaced with a conventional front wing, and then they can go from there. Mercedes seem a lot more settled now, and now we can finally have the notion of 9 drivers going for a potential win. Yep, you heard me. 9 drivers from 5 teams. Yeah. And especially when you hear McLaren's Andrea Stella admit that around Montreal, Mercedes were a force to be reckoned with. And had it not been for Russell making errors and Hamilton qualifying lower than expected, that car might have won in the changeable conditions and lower temperatures. When it comes to the other teams, Aston Martin are bringing some updates for Spain as well. Again, the extent of these upgrades aren't quite clear, but hopefully they'll have a better understanding of these tweaks than they did in Imola, where they completely failed, and really hammered it home for all of us that Aston Martin really need to sort things out, or they can forget 4th place in the Constructors. They could maybe even forget 5th place, because Racing Bulls, Tsunoda, Ricciardo, they're looking stronger by the race. And yeah, we might have a major humbling come the end of the year if they end up Aston Martin 6th. You get a major sense of Fernando's retirement not being that far away, since we're getting more and more news articles where Alonso's talking about when he's going to say bye-bye to F1 than him talking about his future in the sport like he was a couple of months ago. Seriously, you gotta pay attention to the comments heard from Fernando Alonso, because the more you hear about him glowing about the team, all is good. But when you start to get more ruminations and lamentations about what's going on within Formula One, then yeah, you could easily expect things to hit the fan sooner than later. Williams are promising more things though, and Albon's been really coy and mysterious and cryptic when it comes to the ultimate potential of the FW46, because one thing has been made clear, that car is a chonker, and if it suddenly becomes not a chonker, it could be very good. It could be the 5th or 6th fastest car, and could maybe give Aston Martin yet another thing to be happy about. But so far, Williams is being really defensive as to where the potential of this car could be. But where it could be could all be telling if Carlos Sainz signs on the dotted line and all of those rumours are true about him penciling a 4-year deal. Can you imagine that? 4 years, that's a big commitment. And yes, of course, 2 of those years are potentially on probation. If Carlos Sainz doesn't like what he sees, he can go, no penalties, no questions asked, there you go. So having that kind of freedom to leave, ooh, okay. What is Williams up to? Well, you can go and check out my video from the other week as to why I think Williams for Sainz is actually not that bad. But either way, it sounds like a really easy thing to do. Drop 4/10, just make lighter parts, then you're all good to go. But you've really got to think about a lot of things, because it's all very well and good saying make the car lighter, but how are you going to do that? Are you just going to make the parts lighter? Then, okay, sure, you'll then affect reliability because those parts will be more flimsy, they'll be more fragile, they might break easily. And then sure, you might have a fast car, but if you just look at it funny, it'll fall apart. So therefore you'll be back to square one and you'll have nothing to show for it. But either way, instead of trying to predict where Williams is going to end up, let's predict on the Spanish Grand Prix itself. So when it comes to who will win the Spanish Grand Prix, I think it's easily going to be Max Verstappen, because right now he is driving angry and he's been buoyed by the fact that the Canadian Grand Prix showed that even though the odds were stacked against him and I predicted he would get 3rd, he still won anyway, because a lot of the competition are still duking it out amongst themselves, as we saw with Russell and Norris. If Max Verstappen can get pole, it's quite clear he can easily dictate the race and make things a lot easier for himself, as again we saw in Montreal. He can get ahead, he can do whatever he likes. And the upgrades that they might be bringing is certainly clear that they are going to be guaranteed to be gearing itself towards Max Verstappen's characteristics, because right now, Checo is showing that he is finding it harder to acclimate himself to the RB20, much like how it was for the RB19, and then the RB18, and then the RB16B. Yeah, there's a trend going on here, and that just seems to be a symptom of being a Red Bull teammate to Max Verstappen. That's just the way it goes. Max can get more out of the car. And I think that will be the same thing again for every single upgrade that Red Bull bring to the table this year. Given the fact that curbs aren't really that much of an issue at the Circuit de Catalunya, it's a lot more open than some of the tracks that we have seen, then I think we could see a really sturdy and compelling Red Bull response. But the fact they're on the back foot somewhat, or just leaning slightly back on the back foot, does give us some hope for some interesting competition this year. We might see a few more wins going to a team that isn't Red Bull. Then, second place, Charles Leclerc. Yes, I know, given what happened in Canada, this seems like a flight of fancy, but we gotta remember, Canada was an outlier where reliability was compromising that car seriously. And I feel like these upgrades that they are bringing to the table, these are fundamental upgrades which will be, again, geared towards Charles Leclerc because Carlos Sainz is leaving. Yeah, Carlos might be able to adapt somewhat more than Checo can, but the fact of the matter is that Charles Leclerc, he's got to win this year, he's doing really well, and he's motivated. He's got the bugbear of Monaco off of his shoulders, and if the car is remaining true to itself and its original identity, and also is bulletproof, then I can fully expect a response where, sure, Leclerc might not be right on the back of Verstappen, but he might be within 10 seconds of the guy, which is more than could be said for what happened most of last year. And quite frankly, I feel like this version of Ferrari can bounce back from things a lot faster than the Binotto era of Ferrari, or even before then. The Vasseur era, I have a lot more confidence in them. Then for third place, I've got Lando Norris. All three teams. Then I've got Lando Norris in third place. Yes, all three teams are bringing major upgrades, but as far as I can tell, McLaren's upgrades are more under the hood. They're less obvious parts. Instead of going for floor changes, wing changes, or a change in side pods, they seem to be more mechanical bits and gubbins that they might have learnt more from since Miami. It might provide some results for sure, but they might be a little bit less discernible and more kind of just under the hood, maybe for weight saving or reliability, we don't know. But there'll be a refreshed car. I think both drivers are getting them, but I feel like Lando might get some more out of it, and that maybe the momentum might be back with him. But I think out of the three teams, I think McLaren might be bringing the least amount of upgrades, but again, we'll find out later this week what is exactly the case. Then fourth place, Carlos Sainz. Yes, Montreal was an absolute howler with that really slow spin, but fourth place I still think is within reach of Carlos, especially with those comprehensive Ferrari upgrades that are coming his way. He is a lot more adaptable than Checo, as I just said with Verstappen, but I do feel like the other extra contributing factor is that he is driving hungry Carlos, and now, if the rumours are meant to be correct, he does have a seat for next year with Williams, and that it does look compelling that he could be the team leader or at least team partner with Albon, and that maybe he might have a point to prove, go out on a high. And having your future secured, it will make a difference, because the last few races, Carlos has been sort of in limbo. The idea of going to Audi, sort of dissipating, the Red Bull, Mercedes plans, they're not working, so maybe Sainz's headspace might be a lot better than it has been since, I don't know, maybe Australia or something like that. But I certainly think that fourth place is on the cards. He might be close to Lando, but again, we need to see exactly what these upgrades can pan out for both drivers. But either way, I think both Ferrari drivers will be in the top 5. As for fifth place itself, Lewis Hamilton actually, over George Russell. Canada was an odd one for Lewis. He did look really fast throughout practice. Lewis was on it at one of his favourite tracks, but then suddenly in qualifying he wasn't. And yes, I know about the whole tyre blankets thing, about them being a couple of degrees cooler than they should be, but remember, things that are made, machines, mechanical things, bits that were meant to work one way but don't, it happens. Reliability issues are a thing. And Lewis Hamilton really needs to dig deep and realise that, hey, George Russell can make mistakes. Lewis, in his endgame strategies towards the end of a race, he is on fire. And if he can qualify slightly better, we might see a much more rejuvenated Lewis. We might see him contending for the podium like he almost did in Canada. But if we can see that more and more, and he qualifies solidly, and that any more issues are left completely away from him, and he can actually have a clean and uncomplicated qualifying session, get into Q3 with these upgrades, and the fact that it's seemingly becoming clearer that the aerodynamic profile of the W15 is a lot more stable than it was, and if the cooling issues are now sorted, especially since it's about 23, 24 degrees expected for the Spanish Grand Prix, I could easily see Lewis being in the top 5, and that he might have a solid race without any complications, no need for any cryptic or awkward sound bites, no. An uncomplicated weekend, whilst not challenging for the podium right now, certainly a lot closer than they were a few races ago. I certainly think with a couple more upgrades, Mercedes will be right in the mix, potentially, for solid podium finishes and maybe the win. Why do I put Lewis ahead of George? Well, I think there'll probably have been discussions behind the scenes, given the fact that Mercedes have been imploding in terms of their public image, that both drivers need to cool it and realize that they need to think about the greater good when it comes to their team as a unit. Because right now, Mercedes as a team are looking good, but their driver lineup is looking absolutely terrible. Seriously, Toto really needs to stamp out these potential conspiracy theories. Something I touch upon in this video here that you can go and watch right now. Mercedes, they're so close to getting back on top, or at least close, but these things, man, these are fundamental flaws, my god.